Created as a floating platform for heavy guns, the battleship evolved into the world's first strategic weapon. One broadside could send up to 10 tons of high explosives into an enemy at supersonic speeds. From the frigid waters of the North Atlantic to the blood-soaked beaches of the Pacific, from Dreadnought to Missouri, this is the story of the battleship. Next on Weapons at War.
The oceans cover 2/3 of the Earth's surface. So naturally, when man became more confident of his skills in maneuvering on water, a great new power passed into his hands. The mighty Romans were never at ease on the high seas, while later empires, such as the British, found it to be the key to their conquests. Before long, the strength of a nation would be measured by the number of battleships sailing under its flag. These juggernauts of destruction, bristling with guns and sheathed in armor, epitomized naval power.
Wisconsin, that's affirmative, over.
These men are preparing to unleash the devastating power of man's most impressive weapon of war. The United States battleships Wisconsin and Missouri had been called to the Persian Gulf in response to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait.
Rider 700, Rider 74, contacting you shortly. Whiskey required grid for that reference point.
Now, as Operation Desert Storm commences, these two giants, the last of their breed, will fire in anger for the first time in nearly 40 years. For 3.5 weeks, Wisconsin and Missouri will blast Iraqi positions inside Kuwait. Their long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles will seek out targets in Baghdad. And radar-controlled Phalanx Gatling guns stand silent vigil, ready to sweep the sky of any intruder. But what stirs the hearts of the crew and captures the imagination of all who witness its incredible display are the guns. Each 16-inch monster will hurl 2,700-pound shells into the enemy at 1,700 miles per hour. The thunderous blast and sheets of flame define the mystique of the battleship. From its origins as a multi-decked wooden line of battleship in the 16th century, to its ultimate expression in the sleek Iowa class of World War II, the battleship's primary function has remained constant: to serve as a firing platform for batteries of heavy guns. The heaviest concentration of firepower which could be amassed on a seagoing warship. It was fundamentally a floating, self-propelled fortress. The modern battleship was born of the smoke and clamor of the Industrial Revolution, and its rapid development was driven by the epidemic colonialism that swept the world in the late 19th century.
With the introduction of the steam engine, of armor plating made from steel, which is basically a reworked iron, and the use of modern technology such as the rifled barrel for a gun, suddenly these three innovations gave the battleship designers something they could go forward with, something they could create a fast, effective, mighty weapons system. The rifled barrel of a gun is a series of grooves put in the gun which enables the projectile to start to rotate. That gives it accuracy and range far beyond that of the conventional smoothbore gun of that time. So obviously it was going to be a winner. It was going to be the thing that naval architects wanted to put on their ships. Battleship designs and battleship blueprints were the things that every spy wanted to get in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and it produced tremendous rivalry then between Britain and Germany in particular, but also between Imperial Russia and Imperial Japan.
Theorists, such as the American Alfred Thayer Mahan, argued convincingly for large fleets of capital ships that would steam great distances to destroy the enemy's battle fleet. His doctrine of command of the seas was endorsed as gospel by the world's navies.
The United States was relatively slow to get into the battleship race. This is probably because the American steel industry was in its infancy. And in fact, the designs for our first two battleships came from the British. Those two ships being the Maine, which was of course destroyed in Havana Harbor, and the first battleship, Texas. They performed well at Manila Bay in the Philippines and at Santiago Bay in Cuba. However, we noticed that we had fired several thousand rounds for a few hundred rounds that were in fact hits. So clearly there was a need for improvement in our gunnery.
The Japanese demonstrated their mastery of naval tactics when they defeated the Russians at Tsushima in 1905. The Japanese fleet opened fire at 7,000 yards, twice the normal range. Their aggressiveness and superior tactics included capping the Russian T.
Gunfire in the Navy is more accurate in deflection or in bearing than in range. And if one is able to place his fleet so that it passes in front of an enemy formation, all of the guns fore and aft of the capping formation can be brought to bear against only the forward guns of the arriving squadron. Moreover, the accuracy and deflection is borne out, and the range dispersion falls along the length of the enemy vessel.
To the navies of the world, the decisive victory at Tsushima meant bigger guns on faster ships. In 1906, a new warship appeared in Portsmouth, England. First Sea Lord Sir John Fisher referred to a motto on the family crest to name the new ship: "Fear God and dread naught." Dreadnought was revolutionary in her reliance on big guns and radical new propulsion.
They had steam turbines which gave them greater power and greater speed. They basically could outfight anything they couldn't outrun.
In one definitive gesture of weapon design, every other warship in the world was rendered obsolete. The outbreak of war in August 1914 found the British and Germans facing each other with large and deadly battle fleets. USS Texas. She is the second warship to carry the name of that state, which currently oversees her restoration. Commissioned in 1914, she served in the First World War. She is the last of that era. Gun turrets of the age had evolved into multi-layered engineering marvels. They were the most complex and heavily armored components on the ship and took years to build. They were massive, efficient engines of death.
Projectiles arrived inverted on the upper hoist in a shell car. When they reached the top, they were tilted backwards onto a transfer tray and rolled onto the loading tray, where they were then rammed into the weapon. Once the projectile had been seated, powder bags were passed up from the gun pit below in groups of 2. They were placed on the rammer tray and rammed in by a team of 2 men using a wooden pole. Once all 4 bags, or 420 pounds of powder, had been loaded, the breech was swung closed and a cartridge was placed in the firing mechanism for the subsequent round. About 16 men operated this level of the turret. Temperatures in here could raise to approximately 120 degrees.
The gun pit. 2 men worked here, hefting 105-pound powder bags up to the guns. When the guns fired, they had to lie flat on their backs to avoid the recoil. The shell deck. Armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds were transferred from the magazines up to the gun house.
Approximately 72 men were required to man one of these turret complexes. And for some of them, this single ladder was their only escape in the event of battle damage.
The magazine. Hundreds of powder bags and projectiles were stored here. A spark of flame within these chambers could spell disaster. Such was the fate of 3 British cruisers at Jutland in 1916, when the Germans sought to break the British blockade. In a day and a night off the coast of Denmark, 8,500 men were killed. 14 British and 11 German ships went to the bottom.
The Battle of Jutland was probably the most important and certainly the best known naval engagement of the First World War. The British were very confident. They basically outnumbered the Germans. They thought they had better intelligence. One thing they didn't have was good damage control. The Germans managed to engage first. They managed to sink several important battleships. They sank them because the shells penetrated to the magazines. A flash fire developed which ripped open most of the ships that were hit. It was this lack of damage control which led the British to not lose the Battle of Jutland, but not to win it.
If Jutland can be considered a tactical victory for the Germans, it was equally a strategic defeat. The British fleet held the blockade, securing the Kaiser's fate. When the war ended in 1918, one of the conditions of armistice was the surrender of the entire German Navy. The once proud high seas fleet steamed single file into Scapa Flow in Scotland. Texas was among the Allied battleships on station to receive the only surrender of a battle fleet at sea. In an ominous nod to the future, the procession was shadowed from above by British aircraft. During the years following the Great War, the battleship remained the standard of naval strength. It was the most powerful and best protected weapon platform in the fleet. With eyes on the Pacific, the United States embarked on a naval arms race with Japan, building new classes of battleships with even larger guns. The British Parliament and American Congress rebelled at the potential cost. In 1921, An international conference was convened in Washington, D.C. for what proved to be the world's first attempt at limiting strategic weapons. New battleship construction was banned for 10 years, and limits imposed on the size and numbers of existing vessels.
The United States fleet was paired both in terms of scrapping existing warships and destroying those new warships that had been under construction. The battleship Texas, as a matter of fact, was assigned the task of sinking the nearly complete battleship Washington, which would have been a member of the Colorado class.
The treaty did permit aircraft carriers, which allowed the conversion of what would have been the cruisers Lexington and Saratoga. It also gave new life to older battleships, like Texas.
Typically, they received torpedo blisters designed to absorb the shock of torpedo hits along the hull, new masts that were stiffer and more able to support fire control instruments than the preceding cage masts, somewhat better anti-aircraft protection, and in the case of Texas, the 14 coal-fired boilers were replaced by 6 oil-fired boilers, which gave the ship greater range and easier refueling.
At the very moment the preeminence of the battleship seemed assured, developments in the air posed serious questions about its future.
General Billy Mitchell of the US Army Air Corps was one of the pioneers of the development of aerial bombardment of ships at sea using aerial weapons. He wanted to prove that aircraft would be capable of sinking warships. He wanted to prove that battleships in particular were no longer invincible.
The Navy, not unmindful of aerial attacks, was in the process of testing effects of bomb damage on obsolete and captured warships. In 1921, under pressure from Congress, the Navy invited Mitchell to participate. From the start, it became apparent that he was playing fast and loose with the rules. Mitchell's professional reputation rested on sinking, not examining, a battleship. More than once, the Navy boarding teams had to cut short their inspections as Mitchell's Army bombers bore in on the targets. Finally, on June 21, with cabinet members, senators, and congressmen observing, the order was given to go after the captured German battleship Ostfriesland, a veteran of Jutland. Beginning with 1,000-pound bombs in the morning, the final blow was delivered by 2,000-pounders in the afternoon. In minutes, the tough old warrior rolled on her back and disappeared into Chesapeake Bay. Billy Mitchell had gotten his battleship.
The battleship sailors argued, of course, that these ships were neither defended by anti-aircraft fire nor given the benefit of damage control after the hits had occurred. But the lesson was clear and the trend was irreversible. Many U.S. fleet problems demonstrated that ships, particularly those in port in areas such as Pearl Harbor, could be attacked successfully from the air.
Sunday, December 7th, 1941, 7:45 a.m.
We saw the airplanes come in, but nobody really paid any attention to them because, of course, we weren't at war, and we thought that they were coming from Schofield, that they were our own planes. So this is how we started the attack.
The American fleet at Pearl Harbor had been the only real threat to the Japanese strategic objective, the oil and rubber of Southeast Asia.
Well, the Arizona was just, you could hardly see anything. It was just nothing but smoke, flames, and terror. We were conscious that the foremast was tilted forward, as you see in these pictures, but mainly it was just terrible smoke, terrible flame.
The Japanese already knew the value of preemptive strikes. They used one against the Russian fleet in 1905. The British attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto in November of 1940 had demonstrated what carrier-based aircraft could do. The Japanese pursued a similar plan.
West Virginia had been hit by, it turned out, 7 torpedoes. And West Virginia was in terrible shape. Next to the Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia lost more people. They had a fearful problem down below because of the torpedoes that hit her. Why she didn't roll over, nobody knows, but she settled straight down.
It took us about 11 minutes to actually settle to the bottom. I dove over the ship and swam back over there where that tree is. And then I came back to this area here because there were so many people in the water. So we dove back into the water. We were covered with oil anyway, so it didn't make any difference. So we went into the water. The guys that were floating was hollering for help. We brought them ashore. Some of them we laid right along here that were wounded. We picked up all of those guys, and then they had a bomb truck come in, and then they were taking them to the officers club, which they converted into a kind of an emergency dispensary. Then the ones that were dead, we just brought them up and kind of left them along the beach here so that they would take them away later.
Nevada is the only battleship to get underway during the attack.
As we were coming out now, we had been hit on the port side with a torpedo, so we were pretty far down the bow. We had counter-flooded starboard side forward because of a fire in order to save the anti-aircraft magazines. Admiral Train was worried that the ship would block the harbor. Every time he watched us, he'd see us going deeper in the water, and he just was convinced we were going to sink. So he ordered us to run aground in order to keep us from sinking in the channel. Of course, that's what the Japanese hoped we would sink in the channel too, because we would have blocked the harbor and then nothing had gotten out.
For the cost of 29 aircraft, the Japanese had effectively neutralized the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The American aircraft carriers had been providentially spared. Not even the victorious Japanese immediately grasped the implications. The cauldron of flame and smoke that was once the most powerful fleet in the world redefined the role of the big gun ships and changed the character of warfare at sea. While the Allies were reeling in disarray in the Pacific, the adversaries in Europe had positioned themselves into a deadly game of cat and mouse on the high seas. Britain was once again dependent on the sea lanes for her lifeblood. Germany had to sever those arteries. The German admirals were overtaken by events when war broke out in 1939. Hitler had promised them a war later rather than sooner.
Hitler told his admirals that there would not be a war prior to 1946. They therefore embarked on a design and construction program that would have led to a balanced fleet at that time with significant numbers of battleships, carriers, cruisers, etc.
In February 1939, the battleship Bismarck slid down the ways in Hamburg. She and her sister Tirpitz were the largest battleships ever built for the German Navy, the heaviest ever to come out of Europe. Displacing almost 50,000 tons and armed with 8 15-inch guns, Bismarck could attain a speed of 30 knots and sail unrefueled almost 10,000 miles. She was the embodiment of Germany's resurgence and the military power of the Reich.
When the Bismarck and her consort, the cruiser Prince Eugen, broke through the British blockade in 1941, there was great fear that she would destroy a great number of ships in the British convoy system.
For months, the British had kept a battle force in northern Scotland to counter the German battleship threat. 2 fast ships make way to the area of Bismarck's last sighting in the Denmark Strait. Prince of Wales, a newly commissioned battleship, and Hood, a World War I-era battlecruiser. For millions of Englishmen, Hood represented the heroic tradition and strength of the Royal Navy. The British established contact on the morning of May 24th. Prince of Wales fires the first salvo from a range of 15 miles. The German rangefinders and fire control radar are superior. Almost immediately, Prince Eugen has the range, and in 1 minute scores a hit on the Prince of Wales. As Hood turns to bring the full force of her 15-inch guns to bear, Bismarck releases a deadly accurate salvo. One of Bismarck's 15-inch shells causes an uncontained explosion below decks. Hood is blown completely in half. When the smoke and the debris clear, the pride of the Royal Navy has disappeared. Out of a crew of 1,400, 3 men are alive. It had taken just 10 minutes.
The loss of HMS Hood during the hunt for the Bismarck in 1941 was a considerable blow to the morale of the Royal Navy. It was a ship which was considered to be so famous that it must be invincible.
Bismarck, losing oil from a damaged fuel tank, releases Prince Eugen and heads for port. For 3 days, nearly 40 ships pursue Bismarck as she makes for the safety of the French coast and the protection of the Luftwaffe. Only the carrier Ark Royal has a chance of stopping or slowing Bismarck's progress. On the 26th of May, in the gathering dusk, a last flight of Swordfish torpedo planes is launched. The fate of the Bismarck would be decided by the success of this mission. The flimsy Swordfish press home the attack. 2 torpedoes explode harmlessly against her armored hull. A 3rd jams her rudder. Unable to steer, Bismarck waits for the inevitable. At 9 the next morning, the British battleships Rodney and King George V, with cruisers and destroyers, began a relentless 2-hour barrage. Unable to maneuver, Bismarck is struck by no less than 40 large caliber shells. Her own guns are out of action. Multiple fires are raging on her deck and superstructure, but she is still afloat. The British cruisers are called in to finish the job with torpedoes. At 10:40, the Bismarck disappears. Admiral Sir John Tovey, who commanded the British fleet, would write in his dispatch to the Admiralty, quote, "The Bismarck put up a most gallant fight against impossible odds, worthy of the old days of the Imperial German Navy, and she went down with her flag flying," unquote. As the Allies regroup from initial setbacks and take the offensive, the roar of the big guns would be heard not far at sea, but close to shore, near countless beaches and harbors on both sides of the globe. In Europe and in the Mediterranean, gunfire support became a priority for the big ships, in North Africa and Sicily and in Normandy.
This was the most awful sight you've ever seen in your life, with all the guns and bullets flying. We lost many men there trying to scale the walls, and these LCIs, land craft infantry, which had 150 men on each ship, and you'd see some of those just go under. You know, they were hit directly from the shore batteries. They had to have the battleship into these battles because we had to knock out their transportation, railway cars bringing up men, and the infantry coming in.
D-Day, June 6, 1944. To the thousands of troops hitting the beaches, the thunder of the guns became music to their ears.
It's hard to describe the noise and how you feel, especially on the 14-inch guns. A ball of fire just envelops your whole body from top to bottom. And as soon as you get over that, another one hits. And these guns are firing incessantly. You need to fire as fast as you can to save our boys' lives over there who are going up and scaling these walls and keeping these troops from coming to reinforce the ones that are already there.
The battleship persisted in Europe until the advancing ground forces had outdistanced the range of the big guns. Most headed east to join their sisters fighting a different kind of war in the Pacific.
The British airborne attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto and the Japanese attack on the U.S. fleet in Pearl Harbor forever changed the role battleships would be allowed to play. A new star emerged from the maelstrom of the Second World War, and in 1942, the age of the aircraft carrier began.
Battleships played an important role in the Pacific, but not in the manner for which they were originally designed. Decisive battles between lines of opposing dreadnoughts had been relegated to history because battleships no longer comprised the main strike force of the fleet. The proof came in 1942 at the battles of Coral Sea and Midway.
This was significant in terms of battleship development, as it was the first engagement in which the opposing surface forces never sighted one another. The following battle at Midway in June eliminated the offensive capability of Japanese air power by sinking 4 Japanese carriers.
The Battle of Midway marked the end of the strategic role of battleships, but not their importance. Older pre-war dreadnoughts, such as New Mexico, Mississippi, Idaho, would lend their massive firepower to support amphibious assaults across the Pacific. Even the Pearl Harbor casualties, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, Nevada, and West Virginia, were repaired and sent back into service. The Navy was changing its tactics. Although never designed for the role, new battleships would see most of their action as escorts to the Essex-class carriers that were spearheading the race across the Pacific. In August 1942, the Iowa was launched at the New York Navy Yard. She and her 3 sisters, New Jersey, Wisconsin, and Missouri, were the products of research begun in 1937. They were essentially refinements of the earlier North Carolina and South Dakota classes. "860 feet long, 107 feet at the beam, the Iowas were the largest battleships to come out of America's shipyards.
Built with all the lessons learned from watching the British and the Germans slug it out in the early part of the Second World War, and built with all the best technical innovation that was available at the time, including armor plating in the right places to protect the magazines, to protect the boilers and the engines, on the decks and on the sides against torpedoes. Very large guns, good range-finding equipment, good stable platforms able to deliver shells at long distances.
The Iowas had been designed to reinforce the battle line, to inflict lethal damage. The 16-inch, 50-caliber main battery was the most destructive ever used by the Americans. Each gun was 68 feet long and weighed 120 tons. They fired both the 2,700-pound armor-piercing and 1,900-pound bombardment rounds, 2 per minute at a range of 24 miles. Each of the Iowa's 3 gun turrets weighed over 1,800 tons. They were completely built on land, tested, then torn down in sections and reassembled on the ship. Compared to the World War I era turret, the Iowas provided a lower silhouette, more protection, and improved compartmentation. Only the Japanese Yamato's 18-inch battery was larger. The Yamato and her sister Musashi were the largest battleships ever built. They never fought the Iowas, succumbing instead to American submarines and dive bombers. Life aboard the Iowa class was much the same as on other battleships, but on a larger scale. 2,800 men lived for months at a time in a noisy and cramped city afloat. Few complained, given the alternatives.
The sailors usually want to talk to soldiers. I was no exception. I'd look up a soldier and we'd start talking about everything, you know. During these conversations, I found out that they just be scared to death to get on that ship, that big battleship out there, and having to go through all the torpedoes it's going through and the shore batteries and everything. They can just envision everything in the world hitting that ship, you know, and causing it to sink, and you go with it. And I always thought while they were talking, my gosh, and these guys don't know where they're going to sleep tonight. You know, a soldier's life is hell.
As the tempo of operations against Japan increased, the carrier groups came within range of land-based aircraft. The battleship's anti-aircraft batteries faced an increasingly desperate enemy. In October of 1944, the first kamikazes would appear at Leyte Gulf in the Philippines.
This is one of the ship's 10 Mark II quadruple Bofors gun mounts, designed by a Swedish firm and often referred to as Bofors mounts. Each mount could fire rounds out to about 11,000 yards horizontally or over 22,000 feet vertically. The Bofors mount was manned by a crew of 11. There were 4 first loaders. They fed clips such as this 4 round into these loader pawls to achieve about 160 rounds a minute per gun.
The kamikazes never sank a battleship or fast carrier, although 38 smaller vessels and several thousand seamen fell victims to the divine wind. When the Japanese surrendered, General Douglas MacArthur stipulated that the formal ceremonies take place aboard a U.S. battleship in Tokyo Bay. On September 2nd, 1945, the USS Missouri became the most famous ship in the world, a distinction she still holds. When North Korea struck across the 38th parallel in June of 1950, only the Missouri was ready to help the beleaguered South. Her sisters had been retired and were resting in mothballs. Missouri's big guns proved so valuable that her 3 sisters were resurrected as well. Jet aircraft could get there faster, But only the battleships could remain on station for days at a time, providing precise and sustained fire support to the ground troops. After their retirement in 1958, no one gave the Iowas much chance for survival. World War II battleships didn't quite fit the image of a new high-tech Navy. Ten years later, in Southeast Asia, the high rate of aircraft losses and the need for more effective fire support forced the Navy to reevaluate its thinking. In April of 1968, the New Jersey was recommissioned. For the second time since VJ Day, the big ships demonstrate their unique capacity to rain death on the enemy in any weather, day or night.
American battleships were able to throw tons and tons of high explosives onto Viet Cong and North Vietnamese positions, often enabling them to penetrate bunkers and command posts, and so to do work which would soften up before marine operations or infantry attacks.
In spite of her successes, New Jersey's crew is stunned to learn in August of 1969 that their ship will be decommissioned. In one combat tour, New Jersey delivered over 5,600 rounds of 16-inch ammunition, more than in World War II and Korea. In fact, she had been so effective in her assigned role, the North Vietnamese singled her out as an impediment to the ongoing Paris peace negotiations. New Jersey's retirement was ordered by the White House. The success of cruise missiles against Iraqi targets during Operation Desert Storm represents a victory of high technology, of stealth, of smart weapons. But the high-tech war in the Gulf also witnessed the vindication of that decidedly ancient technology, the battleship. After a decade of prolonged debate, during which its demise seemed inevitable, the battleship emerged in its most deadly form. Their Tomahawk cruise missiles can carry either 1,000-pound or cluster bomb warheads. Tomahawk skims the earth at 100 feet, reading the ground to find its pre-assigned target. The Phalanx close-in weapons system provides the modern equivalent of the Bofors and 3-inch anti-aircraft guns of World War II. Firing 3,000 rounds a minute, Phalanx sprays an incoming target with terrifying force. Since their first combat engagements almost 50 years ago, the Iowa battleships have been called to service in 3 wars. Their firepower and versatility remains unmatched in the history of warfare. They have shown the flag and military resolve of the United States in hundreds of ports of call around the world. The question of their past influence and relevance continues to be debated, but the battleship's most convincing argument is her unparalleled success.
There was once a time when the battleship was the largest mobile structure on the face of the earth. It's doubtful these ships will ever again be the formidable weapons they once were, and we will never again see the likes of mighty ship-to-ship battles. But the pages of history will forever resonate with the thundering power of the once mighty dreadnought.